Housing problems, particularly for working class people, have been a problem since many years in the UK. Problems and attitudes towards social housing have always been there. They have just had many different twists and turns and many different reasons through the last century. So this is the history of the council house. The building of many council houses started to get underway after 1919, under David Lloyd George's government with the production of the Addison Act. Since then, many houses and flats have been built. Council estates, which consisted of many homes with local shops and amenities, started to flourish all around the UK. But since the 1980s, there has been a mass decline in availability, and many people are asking the question, just what went so wrong with the council house? And what was life like for many working class people before the council house? During the 19th century, many cities began to expand. This was due to the Industrial Revolution, so many extra workers were needed. At this time, travel was cumbersome and expensive, not to mention unreliable, so people began to flock to the city where the work was, mainly in London, Glasgow, Liverpool and Newcastle. In this period, any building of homes was down to the private enterprises. They built long, narrow streets with no forward planning, erecting tiny houses and flats with bad lighting, without hot water, shared kitchens and shared outside toilets. They were mainly let as rooms in boarding houses for accommodating single men, who shared not only their rooms, their toilets and washing facilities, but on a shift basis they also shared their beds. The area was becoming cramped. Cities were becoming overshadowed with bad sanitation, and grubby streets and diseases were threatening to spread. All working class and poor people could not afford homes of their own, as mortgages were scarce and expensive and they were only available to the rich. In fear of illnesses spreading to the wealthy areas, upper-class folk began to petition for the government to get involved in the building of new homes for the influx of these new people. The government at the time, led by David Lloyd George, began to listen, and in 1919 the Addison Act was passed. Before the Addison Act, the most important move was in 1890, with the Homes for the Working Class People Act. This was to ensure that improvements were made to existing homes and to clean up boarding houses and shared accommodation. Some voluntary organisations and charities made homes for the poorest families, but mostly private landlords were still responsible for most of the rented properties in the large towns and cities. However, they still demanded high rents for improved, yet still very basic housing. Local councils did at this time have the power to build houses, but most did not get involved. Indeed, some estates did get built, but they were only replacing the slums, so the new homes were set to rehouse those who had been displaced by the previous demolitions. Two problems arose with these new builds in most cases. The slums were dense and housed far more people than the new buildings could rehouse. The second problem was the poorest of folk, set to come back to the areas, could not afford the new rents and migrated to slums they could afford. This meant even more overcrowding in unmodernised parts of the cities and towns. Up until 1919, rents were set at the landlord's demand, so they could charge whatever they liked. The councils who had started to let out properties received no subsidies from the government. New homes were now being built to higher standards than before, with thicker walls and better lighting and in less dense areas. This would demand a higher rent without any help from subsidisation. The poor loses out again. An example of better housing can be seen today in Millbank in Westminster, in London. This was built in 1902 and it was to accommodate over 4,000 people. A small success story. The estate was built after the demolition of the infamous Millbank prison. The Tudor Walters Report. In 1912, a submission known as the Tudor Walters Report was submitted to the government. Raymond Unwin, an architectural engineer at the time, suggested a new garden city, where people could be given dignity not only in their homes but around their homes. He envisaged a minimum size for rooms and a garden around the house, for tenants to enjoy and to be proud. This would encourage tenants to take more care of their dwellings and in the area they lived in. His suggestion included 2 living rooms, 1 main family room and the other for entertaining guests, or to give some quiet for someone in the household who may be ill or recovering. A minimum of 3 bedrooms was recommended also. Remember, families were much bigger back then. He also proposed a scullery and a larder and a bathroom. The most important part of his recommendations were there should be ample light and airflow throughout the house. This must have been a luxury for those people living in squalor in those days. Housing inspectors were employed to visit families to ensure their homes were being well looked after. They looked at curtains, gardens and even the front door just to make sure that these homes were being respected by dwellers. The rent books came with the rule books. People had to abide by these or face penalties or even evictions. This was still a time when social housing was given to those who were working and that was still out of reach for the working class poor and the very poor. I remember as a child my grandmother telling me that the carpets could not reach all the way round the walls. There had to be an island gap. This was to allow any work being done for the contractors to be able to walk all the way around the floorboards and not to get any dirt or any footprints on the carpets. The Addison Act of 1919 and the First World War. I've mentioned this act a few times, so here is what it is and what difference it made to social housing. Named after the author Dr. Christopher Addison, the name of the act was actually called the Housing and Town Planning Bill. After the First World War, there was a massive need for housing, so there was an ambitious plan to build 500,000 homes in 3 years. However, less than half were actually built due to budget cuts and the poorer economy in the 1920s. 213,000 homes were actually built, so it wasn't a bad effort. The Act made rented accommodation and home building a national scheme. This would involve all local authorities being directed by the government to provide housing, mainly as a reward for homecoming soldiers and their families. Higher working class people were able to afford the rents, so it was still no fix for the poor. Further acts pushed the councils to provide homes as a social service. In 1924, another act building more homes and another act in 1930 obliged councils to get rid of all remaining slums and build a further 700,000 homes. So, from 1919 to 1935, over 1.1 million new homes were built. The councils got delivered another act in 1937 to ensure that playgrounds, sporting facilities and recreational grounds were provided within the reach of these new estates. That was a busy time for the councils. The largest estate ever built in this period was the Becontree estate in East London, which still survives today. 27,000 homes were built. Mind you, it did take 15 years. Interestingly, the rents in 1920 were around £2 a week. Today's money that works out at around £114. Compare this to today's social housing rents. In the Midlands, a 3-bedroom house averages at £121 per week. In the south, a 3-bedroomed house would set you back around £173 a week. So there's not a lot of difference when you compare. But it does show the cost of council rents back in them days was really high. Compare this today. Private renting, however, a 3-bedroomed in the Midlands is around £1,000 a month. Ready for this? In London, private renting on a 3-bedroom house is around £2,900 a month. That would be a hell of a lot more if you lived in places such as Kensington or Notting Hill. It wasn't until after 1930, when homes were built in the outer city areas, that rents became more affordable to all classes of people. Estates were built on the fringes, where people had to travel longer to get to work. The Art Deco style houses were built on the fringes of London, which inspired extensions to the London Underground network and other travel. An example being trains to Oxbridge, Rayners Lane and Cockfosters on the Piccadilly line alone. Rules to housekeeping were even stricter, and letters of cleanliness were sent out to tenants. The Second World War had come to an end. The war had put a stop on house building on account that materials were needed for the war effort, plus the lack of manpower, owing to workers being restricted to special services such as munitions, transport and essential farm work. Many more nurses and doctors were enrolled for the casualties due to the bombing. For the second time, housing needs became a crisis at the end of the war, because of many houses had been destroyed or irreparably damaged, especially in the south after the Blitz. The new Labour government. Under a new Labour government led by Clement Attlee, it was reported that over 750,000 homes needed to be built. A short-term solution was to build prefabricated houses, mainly bungalows, which could be factory-made and erected quickly. These were estimated to last for 10 years, but they lasted much longer than that. In fact, some still stand today, and some of them are actually still being lived in. Look at these ones in Birmingham. Constructions were basic and had plenty of light and storage space. They had indoor toilets and bathrooms. The prefabs were built in factories where aircraft had previously been constructed for the war effort. Also, prisoners of war that still lived in the UK were employed to help construct them. Over 150,000 of these prefabs were built in 1947, but there was still a major shortage. Still prefabricated, more houses were built using concrete blocks bolted to metal frames, rather like the ones that they used to build high-rise flats in the 1960s. They were efficient to build and required less skill. They were estimated to last for around 60 years, and yes, there are still some of those around today. They did alleviate the urgent need for housing, and the number of families living in social housing had increased from 10% in 1938 to over a quarter of the population in 1945. Demand was getting higher. Interestingly, around 17% of people who live in the UK are in social housing. But you split this between council-owned properties and housing associations, that's probably less than 10% of council tenants as of 2025. But the population figures in 1945 after the war were just below 30 million. Today's figure, 69 million people now live in the UK. Just as a little fact I discovered, in 1066 there were 2.5 million people living in this country. The Second World War had come to an end. A radical change was needed. A new urban vision was on the horizon. The 1930 Act of getting rid of all slums had been set aside due to the war. These places had become more neglected, with families living in one-bedroom, damped, cold derelicts and back-to-back houses, and some still sharing outside toilets with other families. There was a massive depletion of stock due to bomb damage, so it was time, with the influx of even more people flocking to the cities and towns, for something brand new. Major changes took place. We had a new Conservative government in 1951 with Churchill back in the seat, and it pledged to build a new vision, giving housing building back to the private sector. However, damaged homes and slum streets could be bought in bulk by the council. This was by the means of a compulsory purchase order. In the inner cities, this was taking place to demolish old buildings and rebuild a new Britain. This was met in many rundown areas with protests from the residents of the slum communities. They wanted to keep their way of life, with their families and friends around them. The vision they despised was the pioneering cities in the sky reform. Many folks held sittings and mobbed the contractors who believed were not only pulling down their homes, but they were pulling their lives apart. But the protests came to no avail. The slums would be gone forever. Mostly, particularly the younger people, welcomed the new embark on bright new homes, kitted with communal play facilities, shops, schools, playgrounds, libraries, and with heating and hot water at the turn of a tap or just the switch of a control, or the control of a switch, whichever way you want to put it. This was a better life for them. The decline. It wasn't long before people began to feel isolated in these new 6-story blocks. The community spirit had started to diminish, particularly for those living alone or in the upper floors. The concrete jungles, as then called, were seen as hideous, and there would soon be an easy target for crime. This was at the time a solution for masses of people needing homes. More high-rise flats began to be erected in the 1960s and quite densely packed together, forming a concrete community. However, broken lifts, darkly lit alleyways and the lack of community centres, plus little to do for kids and teenagers, soon led to the insurgence of petty incidents of crime. Families soon could not wait to get out. The problems became worse as the 1970s dawned, with the lack of investment and the realisation of how poorly these blocks were built. Missing bolts, poor window frames, damp, and the lack of modernisation made a poor standard of living. It was not long before these areas became no-go zones for many, including postal delivery staff and taxi services. They became so hard to let that councils started to house problem people in the flats, thus escalating bad reports. The tower blocks became dingy and badly managed. Cracks clearly appeared in this great architectural idea. More than 500,000 flats were made available in London alone. Britain's skyline had changed for a short time for the better, but as the decades went by, they were getting demolished and they left a bad memory for many of the former residents. Let's rewind back to the 1940s. The late 1940s, the government could see building in cities alone was never going to be enough to house everyone that needed a place to live. It was time to build a new suburban community, and brand new towns were needed. The New Towns Act. Under the New Towns Act of 1946, there were 3 waves of new towns built to deal with the overspill of the cramped cities. They would have their own places of worship, community centres, libraries, doctors' surgeries and shopping centres. The councils didn't want new residents to crowd the cities for their needs, so it was important that full amenities were made available. Albeit these facilities did trail behind the builds for a while, but they did get built. The first wave of independent new towns was intended to help alleviate the housing shortages. Beyond the green belt around London, 2 sites in County Durham were also designated. These designations were Stevenage in Hertfordshire in 1946, Crawley in Sussex in 1947, Hemel Hempstead in Hertfordshire in 1947, Harlow in Essex, Newtown Aycliffe in County Durham, Aycliffe Newtown, Peterlee in County Durham, Easington Newtown, Welwyn Garden City and Hatfield in Hertfordshire, both in 1948, Basildon in Essex, Bracknell in Berkshire, Corby, Northamptonshire, in 1949. These were roomy, light, modern houses and would cater for middle-class working people to feel at home and very comfortable. The second wave, 1962 to 1964, would be to alleviate the cities in the Midlands, including Dorley Newtown, now called Telford, and the North West. The third wave, up to 1970, would include Milton Keynes and Peterborough, just to name a few. For the majority of towns, it was still a success story. They were built for the population at the time, with plenty of green land and walking spaces, such as parks and meeting areas. However, the late 20th century saw the need for further building in these areas, giving up this land and open space. It has to be said, though, for many people, even though they're not new towns anymore, that they are still a very desirable place to live. It's now the 1970s and council houses were getting older and in more need for repair. Some estates became run down after the government had cut funds for renovation and modernisation. There had been a change in the monitoring of residents, with the rule book almost being thrown out of the window, and home visit inspections had practically ceased. The Labour government at the time, under James Callaghan in the mid-1970s, had discussed the selling of housing stock in order to save money on repairs, and with the view that if people owned their own homes, they would take more pride in their communities and maybe try to improve them. This decision, however, never came to fruition. Well, not yet, anyway. 1979, the Conservative government. Under Margaret Thatcher's new government that took the chair in 1979, it was announced in the following year there was to be a new act, the right to buy. This meant that in certain circumstances, the council tenants could buy their own council home under the new law. Margot Heseltine, MP, had the idea that this would be less of a burden on the state, as the new owners would be responsible for their own repairs, modernisation and insurance. Tenants, depending on how long they lived in their rented house or flat, could get a reduction on the sale price of up to 50%, or even 70% if they lived in flats. Nearly 1 million people took up the opportunity in the first 10 years, resulting in a great reduction of housing stock for the council. Some people actually got their homes for under £10,000 and then sold them later on for 10 times their price. This came with many problems for councils. Some people had bought their own homes, realised it had structural problems. These were the concrete constructions with the metal rods that we talked about earlier. They rusted over the years, making the places hard to get a mortgage and impossible to sell. This is known as concrete cancer. There had been 150,000 of these homes, and a file of complaint by residents or the new owners was made. In 1984, this petition was upheld, and councils were forced to foot the bill for the repair or even to rebuild their houses from scratch. The other problems were that the wealthier people bought their homes in the nicer areas, thus leaving problem areas in the same position before, and hardly any of the flats were sold to tenants. This did not play out the government's dream of relieving councils of the areas they would rather do without. For the first time in a number of years, the building of council houses outweighed the need, and building became less and less. This, with the sale of many council houses, made a massive depletion of council stock. Council house availability had declined. The problem was that with many homes never built to replace those sold, as council budgets were slashed time and time again. Governments have made massive pledges to build what they call affordable housing, but have failed targets and have always encouraged a homeowner Britain, as opposed to European countries who still have a larger rented population than homeowners. Targets have been missed due to planning permissions being turned down, councils on low budgets and greedy landowners asking too much for their land. So what about the future? The new Keir Starmer government is promising millions of homes and waiving some of the red tape. There are, according to the charity Shelter, as of 2025, 272,000 homeless recorded people in the UK. This is a current housing crisis. Homelessness includes people on the streets or in emergency accommodation such as bed and breakfasts and sofa surfing. One of the main reasons for the problem is private tenancy contracts ending and no-fault evictions. It is shown that statistically over 350,000 people contacted their local authority in 2024 looking for support due to the threat of losing their home. Labour's big promise to build 1.5 million homes during their first term. Just how realistic is this? There is also an announcement that the right to buy scheme for council residents will change, with the Chancellor Rachel Reeves slashing the discount for new applicants, making council house buying less attractive. The current Housing Secretary, Angela Rayner, wants to be judged on her plan to ensure that council houses are built to ensure that all people can be housed and not just cater for private landlords and homeowners. It's obvious that the more houses that become available, the lower the costs would be for buying and renting. But do landlords, landowners and sellers really want this? Angela Rayner, by the way, bought her own council house and sold it 10 years later, making a £48,000 profit. Think about that, what you want. Labour has also made changes to the right to buy for councils to make it easier for them to buy social housing to rent out. Using money from their sales, they will use that budget to purchase and build. Labour pledges to make a massive increase in the availability of social housing in the biggest, as they say, in a generation. Labour stated that the process will be sped up by cutting down the red tape, making planning permission easier and using part of the green belt for building. They call it the grey belt. People are already complaining about this. One of the main problems in the past is that protests have arisen when they have not wanted new builds in their areas, spoiling their back garden views. Labour pledges to change legislation to eradicate this. The problems are that many houses are built by large building companies. They cannot be dictated by the government of how many houses they should build. Large enterprises tend to build more when the interest is low, to ensure a quick turn-up of new homes. To ensure a quick take-up of these new homes. But when interest is high, such as now, they slow down the building. Remember, they are doing this as a business and to maximise profits. Remember Barratt Homes? Yes, they are still around and they are the UK's largest home builder. It's hard to believe that many sections of land have already had planning permission to build. However, it's a large policy for larger building companies to land bank and have been accused of holding back on building in order to maximise profits by waiting for the right prices to come along in order to earn more money. Housing stock is mainly profited by dealing in second-hand homes. They set the price market. By building a vast amount of new homes would knock down the prices, which would upset sellers, estate agents, not to mention private landlords who would revisit their rent pricing. Another problem foreseen by experts reveals that if the promise to build many new homes is carried out in a few years, this would make materials for building become more scarce and manufacturers could take advantage of the demand and increase their prices. Private development is promised to increase with the rule of ensuring the amount of properties would be more affordable. So-called affordable housing is, however, 80% of the current selling market, or the rental market. In large towns and cities where the prices are astronomical, this is surely out of the reach of most people. This mainly gives the investor the chance to snap up as many properties as they can at a lower price to rent them out at whatever price they demand. So the pledge of new home building is met with doubt by many experts and forecasters. The current government, of course, replied with their repeated comment, this was the mess left by the previous administration over the previous years. We've all heard that one before. Well, let's not deviate and look at the reality of this mass home building promise. First of all, have we been groomed to believe that we have to own our own home? Has the government allowed private renting prices to spiral out of affordability? But one thing is for sure, we have an ageing population in this country and it's ever growing. This will mean more and more people will need a place to live. Finally, dare I mention migration? This is something there is a major argument for politicians, particularly Nigel Farage. He stated in the last 20 years that the population in the UK had increased by 10 million people, which depletes the availability of housing. This has been debated in a petition for a general election which was signed over 3 million people in 2025. The major argument is against the new Labour government doing very little for social housing.